Hey there, welcome back to Emotionally Wealthy. I hope your summer's going great. I hope that you are doing fun things and making new experiences for you and your family. I certainly am trying to do that. And so, as part of the summer series and in support of taking a little bit of a break, in both June and July, for half of the month, I am giving you a couple of episodes where I was a guest, and I hope you enjoy them. This one in particular that I'm sharing today, I think will hit home for a lot of people. On this particular episode, I am the guest on the Diamonds in Dumpster Fires podcast with Melie Williams. Melie is the host and she is fantastic. Her podcast is great. We talk about all things divorce and well, not all things divorce, but post divorce more than anything. We talk about things like the dating process, why we sometimes choose partners who aren't good for us, but feel familiar, how to recognize our own relationship patterns. Somebody asked about how to know if you're avoiding commitment, and also how to determine whether you're truly ready to date again. So we talked about a lot of those things, a lot of the emotions that we go through. I think you're going to find it really fun and interesting, hopefully. You know, at the end of the day, if you've ever found yourself or know someone that finds themselves repeating the same relationship dynamics or questioning whether they are ready to open their hearts to someone new, I think you're going to find a lot of value in this conversation. So enjoy my conversation with Melie Williams, and please follow her Diamonds in Dumpster Fire podcast. It is great. I'll see you soon.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Diamonds in Dumpster Fires. Today's episode is one that I think a lot of my listeners are going to really relate to because we're going to be talking about something that a lot of people experience, but they don't always say it out loud, and that is the complicated emotional side of relationships and divorce. To help us unpack some of these questions, I am joined today by Karen Conlon. She is a therapist, the host of the Emotionally Wealthy podcast, and she helps people who are successful and self-aware in many areas of life, but maybe find themselves struggling in relationships after divorce or feeling unseen or stuck in patterns. So today's conversation, we're going to talk about emotional well-being, the challenges of healing after divorce, and some of the questions people are often afraid to ask their own therapist in that process. Karen, welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires.
Melie, thank you so much for having me here. I was so excited to have this chat. So let's do this. I'm so excited to be here.
Me too. Before we dive into all the patterns and the emotional stuff related to divorce, I'd love to talk for a second about your podcast, which is called Emotionally Wealthy. What does emotional wealth actually mean?
So, to me, when I thought about the name of the podcast and I went through a lot of different iterations of it, I really was very intentional about putting two words that I think people have preconceived notions about, right? When you think about emotion or emotionally or emotional, sometimes there is a negative connotation to that. And when you think of wealth or wealthy, the relationship that people typically have with that, it has to do with financial success or career or otherwise. And so I really wanted to give people an opportunity to put these two words together that for me really meant the ability to build and recognize trust in your emotional experience, to really understand yourself, to have clarity around your values and your needs. And also, it was really important for me to have a title that also let people know that you can create relationships where there's emotional honesty and authenticity. It is possible without you having to be the one to always be in charge of the emotional labor, which is a lot of times what happens. And so emotional wealth to me is really about all those things, but mostly it comes from self-awareness and having that lens of clarity and understanding that you have needs, that you have feelings, that your feelings are valid, and then learning what to do with those things, knowing that you have a choice. So it's really a lot of those things. But ultimately, emotional wealth to me comes back to being self-aware, owning that self-awareness, and then making very intentional choices to create the life that you want and the relationships that are mutually fulfilling.
What would you say are some of those emotional challenges that people might underestimate about going through one of those scenarios?
Well, I think it depends, first of all, on, who is the one getting out of the relationship or wanting to leave the relationship. Are you on the receiving end? Are you initiating it? But I think one of the things that, regardless of what side you're on, one of the things that really surprises people is that there is grief. And I'll use myself as an example. I am very happily married now for almost 2 decades, but I did have a first marriage, and I was with my ex-husband for about 8.5 years total. And I was the one that decided that this, was not a good match. We were both good people in a not good relationship. And what really surprised me, Melie, was that I actually experienced so much grief, even though I was the one that wanted it. And I think that's one of the things that really is a surprising emotion for people, especially if you're the one that is initiating it. I think the other thing too is the expectation that even though you're explaining, or, there's reason behind it, that there are people that are not necessarily always going to support your decision. And so I think that that's the other piece that I have seen happen. I've experienced it myself, where there's disappointment in the support systems that you thought you would have. So if you are lucky and you do have a really good support system, that's great. That is when you want to really lean on them and choose wisely, for sure, because not everybody needs or deserves your story. You can choose who you share it with and who you're going to be or feel emotionally safe with. But there is an element of that. There's a sometimes a little bit of shaming, a little bit of guilting, or maybe a lot of it, depending on what environment or culture you come from. So those are some of the things that I think people deal with and experience, but they're not really necessarily prepared for or expecting.
I totally agree, especially when it comes to that shaming feeling. I know that, for myself, I'm involved in a church community. And while I would say most people were pretty supportive of me, there were people who let me know subtly and not so subtly that they
Yeah.
disapproved of that decision. And it wasn't even my decisions. I had a guy even say, well, God hates divorce. And it's like, how helpful is that to somebody who's grieving and going through a tough time? That's why I think a lot of people misunderstand how to help somebody in that moment. Can you talk a little to that? Like, what is some ways to be like emotionally healthy as a friend or a family member?
That is a beautiful question, and one that needs to be explored and asked more frequently. One of the biggest challenges I think that people who are supporting friends or family who are going through a difficult time is just the ability to be there. I think that if we can all work on our distress tolerance more, I think we become better friends, we become better parents, we become better members of society overall. And just to elaborate a little bit more on that, for example, if somebody's coming to you with a problem like this, like, I'm really unhappy in this relationship, maybe you're not ready for divorce yet, or separating, whatever the status is, but you are bringing up things that are really uncomfortable. That person could be a great friend in many other ways and have shown to be a great friend. But maybe what you're bringing up is something that is a little bit activating for them. Maybe because it's something that they fear for themselves. Perhaps they witnessed it with their own parents and it was very painful. Or maybe they're just the type of person that feels like, if somebody comes to me with a problem, I'm responsible for taking care of this. Because of all of those things, and we don't really ever know why people do the things they do, it's really important, I think, that for people who are going to be the recipients of heavy information like this, just to kind of learn that, first of all, you don't have to fix it. It is okay to just be there. And as a matter of fact, sometimes the best thing that you could do is just to bear witness to someone else's pain. And I know it's hard. And I know our impulse is to want to try to fix it for other people and make them feel better, or tell them, hey, tomorrow's another day. Also, sometimes there's a fear that people have around saying, well, if I actually agree, I am contributing and I'm going to make it worse. And the reality is that if you can just be there for that person, listen to them, and it's okay to let them know, I don't even know what I would do if I was in your situation. I'm just so sorry that you're going through this. That's okay. That's good enough. That's enough. You don't have to go any further than that. And as a matter of fact, when you do that, what a lot of times ends up happening is that the person feels better because they're not feeling like I am too much for everybody or I'm a burden. If you can hold space just for a little bit for that person, there actually is or can be a shift. Now, let's be real. We do have those friends, and we've all had those friends or family members where that opens up the grounds for you to just be like a dumping ground
Yeah.
for all their stuff, right?
Right.
And so, no pun intended, right? Like with the podcast name, right? So, it does open up the ground for that. And this is where having some internal boundaries for yourself, boundaries, I always say, are not for other people. Boundaries are for ourselves. Boundaries are internal. And so when you can start feeling that little tinge or like become aware, right? That, oof, this is starting to feel very heavy. I'm starting to feel like my body's energy just starting to feel depleted. That's a signal to you that it's maybe time to one way or another step out of this conversation. And so while we don't have to get into it today, but there are strategies and there are things that you can do and practice to very diplomatically and gently either divert the conversation or exit out of it gracefully without hurting the other person's feelings. Although you can't really control that either. You may do it as gracefully as possible and still end up hurting the other person's feeling.
Right. And at the same time, though, we do need to be mindful of ourselves in that we can't focus so much, right, on not hurting the other person's feelings that we're hurting ourselves through not setting those boundaries.
Exactly. Exactly. When you start reacting to things or doing things in a way that ultimately ends up with you feeling like, oh my gosh, I really don't want to be here. I really don't want to listen to this. Well, you have now crossed a threshold where you are not taking care of yourself anymore. It doesn't make you selfish. It doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't make you a bad Christian. It doesn't make you a bad mother, father. Like, if you've reached a point where now you're not going to be helpful to that person, and also now it's also coming down on you, like it is at the cost of your own wellness, that's a really big sign to you. And it's something for you to listen to and maybe think about a little bit later so that you can get out of it if you can.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, here's a question that a listener had sent in regarding healthy healing. She said, you always hear, you have to have healthy healing after divorce. What does that even look like?
That is a loaded question because it's so subjective. And what I mean by that is that it is such a personal thing. But I think one of the first things is that when you are trying to heal after a divorce, the first thing is that I don't think that you need to give yourself a timeline. I think it is healthy for you to say, I don't know when I'm going to feel better. I know that sometimes I feel better, other days I feel worse, and just allow yourself the grace and self-compassion to know that every day might be different for a while. There will be times also, by the way, that you might miss your ex. Our brains have a beautiful capacity of trying to protect us. And so sometimes thinking about the bad things that have happened or, the things about the relationship that really were not so good for us, those get blocked off. And so that is when you have those moments of like, well, maybe it wasn't so bad, or maybe, we could have done better. We could have tried out a little more. And maybe that's all true. However, it's also important for you to, in a healthy way, remind yourself of the whys you got here in the first place. What was your role in it? Taking accountability, I think, is also another very healthy aspect of going through a divorce or separation. When you can take accountability, that gives you power back. You know that, okay, I can't control what the other person did, but this is my part in it. And in that way, you're not a victim of the circumstances or of what happened. You can take control of that aspect of your life by taking that personal accountability. I think another healthy aspect is not comparing yourself to other people.
Yeah.
Especially like with social media, like, oh my gosh, we just have such an amicable relationship afterwards and we're best friends. Hey, I think that's wonderful if you can do that. Great, especially if you have children and you need to co-parent. That's super healthy and good for you. And I applaud that. But that's not possible for everyone. There's so many different dynamics, so many different factors that brought you to where you were. And also, you are not the same person coming out of that relationship that you were going in, right?
Right.
You need to take all of these things into consideration. And rather than comparing yourself to what other people are doing or how they're healing and saying, I should be doing that. I should be doing like a girls trip, a month after this is over. Like, look how everybody's enjoying themselves or whatever it is that you're doing to compare yourself. Stop the comparison. It's not going to help you. It's definitely not going to help your healing. And the only one that you need to compare anyone to is to yourself. How you were doing before, how you're doing now, and maybe think about where you'd like to be. Which brings me to my next point, which is if we have intention, if we have purpose, that is an incredibly healthy thing to do. Because when you have a thought or an idea of where you'd like to be 5 months from now, a year from now, start thinking about it. Don't wait until you're starting to feel better. And I know it's hard. I'm not saying that it's easy, but when you have moments of levity and moments of clarity, use those moments to think about, well, where do I want to be a year from now? How do I want to feel a year from now? What kinds of things do I want to be doing 6 months from now? I would say to take it a step further, write it down, make a collage that you can paste on your bathroom mirror and look at it all the time, because your brain will start to focus on those things. I mean, I'm a little bit of a neuro nerd, so I'm not going to get into it now, but visualization is something that absolutely works. So don't wait until, oh, maybe next week I'll feel better. Maybe next month, maybe after I see my therapist. These are small steps that you can take starting now. They don't cost a thing, and you can do them yourself. You don't have to wait for anybody else or to get permission from anybody else to start that type of healthy healing.
Absolutely. And I love the visualization piece. I actually, in one of my neuroscience classes, we learned about this study that they did where they had people actually work out, lift weights, and then they had people visualize themselves lifting those
Yes.
weights. And they actually had improvement in muscle tone, not anywhere near the people that actually lifted the weights, but that is how powerful our minds are. I love that.
It's incredibly powerful. And I know that you're a neuro nerd too. So you know all about the RAS, the reticular activating system, which is a part of our brains that is involved in this. It's involved in manifestation. And what it basically does is once you start focusing and concentrating and thinking about something, well, your brain starts to actively look for things in your environment that bring you a little step closer, whether you realize it or not, to that. And that's very general, and that's simplifying it to the nth degree. But my point is that the same way that can work for positive things, it can also work for negative things. So, really be conscientious of how you're speaking to yourself. What's that narrative? What's that story that you're telling yourself? Because your brain can also focus on those things. It wants to protect you, but it doesn't always know how to do it the best way possible. So if you're focusing on things like the next bad thing that can happen, or really thinking about how to protect yourself if this happens or that, well, your brain is going to start focusing on finding things that are actually going to reinforce those fears.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Our brains are so powerful. Now, I want to go back to something you talked about. It's completely normal to have those feelings of, missing an ex. And I did have a listener who wrote in and said, I would love to ask a therapist if a woman ever truly gets over her first love. Sometimes I still miss my ex husband, and it's been almost 4 years. And I can relate so much to this. It's been 5 years for me since I got divorced, and that feeling of like, especially if you haven't had closure. And I don't know for this particular person if she was able to get that closure or not, but I do get that feeling of not being over it. What would you say to her?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is I get it. And that's what I would say. I get that. Our first love or our first experience with love, is very much filled with a lot of memories, a lot of hopes, a lot of dreams, that dopamine hit that we get. There are things that altogether are stored in our cells and our memories. And so a lot of times those first loves or those early loves implant themselves in our memories or in our experiences as if they were maybe the relationship to use as a pattern or as a role model for how you should feel in future ones. So I absolutely get that. And who doesn't want to chase that feeling of like, this feels so good, right? Like your love hormones are just going crazy in your body. And so like, yeah, I want to chase that too. But what I would also say to the listener who is wondering about that is, look, the other part of that is that you actually don't really know if that would have worked out. Just because you miss a person doesn't necessarily mean that that relationship should have continued anyway, or that it would have ended up in this dreamy place, this idealized place that you thought it would. The other thing that I think about is, what are the unresolved things that keep you going back to that relationship, right? Like that nostalgia for that time in your life or that chapter that ended. What is it about that chapter in your life that is unresolved and keeps you coming back to it because maybe your current relationships are not fulfilling? Are you perhaps looking for people who are trying to fit, or that you're trying to fit rather, into that box of who that person was, or into the relationship that you thought it was going to be? So that's the other thing that I would explore with that person is, what are some of the unresolved feelings, maybe grief, the nostalgia, and versus what's happening now. What is it that you're looking for that you feel you had or could have gotten in that relationship? Because again, you're not the same person. And so that's the other thing too. Our first loves typically happen when we are, in our teens or late teens, or maybe, early 20s. And so the part of our brains that's even responsible for impulse control and executive function, it's not even fully developed until around age 26 or so. And so we are thinking a lot and feeling a lot in a way, or in a stage rather, where we haven't fully developed the ability to think through things fully rationally, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so I think that that's another important thing. And I think the other thing too that I would say is that it can also be representative that, again, that you're missing certain emotional dynamics in the relationships that you're engaging in now, or maybe a sense of familiarity, right? That relationship once provided. Look, getting into new relationships is hard work. Sometimes it's not all the time, but it does take work. And sometimes it's nice to think about, man, that was so easy. Why can't it be that easy? So
Yeah.
I think it's pretty normal sometimes. So just be kind to yourself and know there's nothing wrong with you. But these are the things, for example, that I would probably be exploring a little bit more if I was working with someone who was struggling with that type of thing.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And along those lines, I did get another question from a listener, and he was wondering, at what point is someone ready to pursue a new relationship? And that one's tough, right? Because it's not like you can't say, okay, if X, Y, and Z are done, you're ready. But are there things like within somebody's own self they could like say, not a checklist, but maybe some ideas to ponder before they get into a new relationship?
Yes. So you're right. It's a difficult question to answer because, again, everybody is going to be different. Everyone is going to be ready in different ways. So I'm going to answer that question coming from my personal perspective and thoughts around it. I would say that when you have done some of the work that has helped you to understand your role in it, because again, right? You cannot control what the other person does. You can't control what the other person did, but you did choose that person, right? You were half of that whole. So I would want you to have thought about, done some real deep reflecting, done some real work around what worked for me in that relationship, because obviously there were parts that worked. What didn't work for me? What continues to not work for me? What do I not want ever again? I would like you to think about, were you, you know, if you're a people pleaser, were you also people pleasing in that relationship? Like over giving? Were you saying yes when you actually wanted to say no, right? Were
Yeah.
you taking responsibility for the other person's emotional well being while abandoning your own? Were you avoiding conflict, right? Even when something didn't feel good or unfair or misaligned with your own values or thoughts, right? Like, were you actively trying to avoid conflict? So, what I would say is to really put a mirror up to yourself, as uncomfortable as that might be. But I think it's important because what you're trying to do is not change yourself, but what you're trying to really do is instead look at all the areas where your strengths lie, right? Because saying yes is not a weakness, but it can be a liability in certain situations. So we're not
Right.
telling you change who you are. We're saying, what are my strengths and when do they become liabilities? When is it difficult for me to advocate for myself? When does it become difficult for me to say no or say yes? Right? When does it become difficult for me to share the fact that I have a feeling or a thought about it? What are my fears? Am I fearing that if I say no, I'm going to disappoint the person? Okay, so what's the worst that can happen if you disappoint the person? Really focusing on the things that served you and the things that no longer served you. Why? Because when you're self aware and you're aware of these things, you will feel a lot more in control of being able to address or change those things about yourself. And notice I keep talking about yourself. This is not about changing other people. I don't care how much you think you can influence. And yeah, you know what? You cannot control or change other people. You can only do that as long as they will let you. Because the day that that other person says, you know what, I actually don't really care about, whether you stay or go or leave or what your threats are, your quote unquote control is over.
Yeah.
And there might be people that don't like to hear that, but it's the truth. So if you really want to make different choices, start with yourself. Start focusing on that relationship that you have with yourself. It is the longest and most important relationship that you'll ever have. And it's the one that you really, truly have agency over. Out of all the relationships that you have in your life, that's the one that you truly have control over.
True. Yes. Now, what do you say to the person who is starting to do this work and they are examining themselves? They're seeing where their patterns were maybe getting in the way of a healthy relationship. And now they're owning it, they're taking their part. But now some shame and guilt is creeping in there because they're like, oh, I'm the problem. Or if only I hadn't done X, Y wouldn't have happened. How do you get out of that shame cycle that I think a lot of people tend to fall into in these moments?
Yeah, and I mean, shame and patterns are typically learned really early on. We very early on, typically in childhood, learn ways of how to receive approval or love or sense of worthiness or how to be safe in an environment. And by safe, I don't mean that you're necessarily in actual danger, but I mean just like not rejected or abandoned or sent away to another room. So even safety, just as far as being allowed to stay in the room, right? Like, what are the things that I have to do or not do or say or not say? So, just because you are aware does not automatically mean that you're going to change conditioned behavior.
Mhm.
And so that is why self-awareness and awareness is just one piece of it. The other part of it is understanding the patterns and the subconscious or unconscious psychological bus that's driving your behavior. Emotions often drive our behavior. And so becoming aware of them is really important, because that is one of the things that's absolutely going to help you change and address those patterns that are not helping you anymore. Like, I work with a lot of high achievers, for example, who are conditioned to use success and performance and productivity as a way of getting approval and feeling valued or feeling worthy. And for those folks, they often learn that their value comes from performing or meeting other people's needs. That dynamic starts very early on, and then it does carry into their other relationships if they're not aware. But then even when they do become aware, it's like, well, how do I change this? I don't know what to do, because this is the only way that I've known how to function.
Right.
So I think oftentimes people intellectually understand their patterns, but they're still struggling to sit in the discomfort of expressing needs and setting boundaries for themselves and things like that. So I think those are the things I think to be aware of and to look at when you're thinking about sort of that next step or that next level.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Now, I did get one question that I thought was really interesting. Someone asked, how do you know whether you are just emotionally independent after a divorce and don't necessarily need a new relationship, or whether you're actually afraid of intimacy and avoiding it? So, how do you know whether you are stuck in those patterns maybe and have just put up a wall, or whether you are actually a healthy state single? Because there are some people who are healthy and thriving single and don't need a partner, right? So, how do we tell?
So that is an excellent question. And it's an excellent question. And it sounds to me like the person who sent that in has really done a lot of the work, because that's kind of like a next level question, right? I've done the work. I'm out there, and now I am really being intentional about how I'm feeling. I want to check in with myself. I really want to get to know myself. So that sounds to me like a person who is doing that work, that inner work, with clarifying the relationship that they have with themselves. So I think that's incredibly healthy. Emotional independence, I think, is an interesting way of saying it. I think that when you are emotionally independent, to me, what that means is that you don't feel responsible for other people's emotional well-being. Now, if you're a parent, I'm not talking about that, right? Because if you're a parent of children, yes, you absolutely are responsible, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about two adults. And I'm going to say this, and I don't know if this is going to be popular or not, but I'm not just talking about like an intimate partner. I'm talking about like parents and other relationships. There's only so much that you can do to try to help a person feel better. Ultimately, that's a very internal thing that happens. And so when I think about emotional independence, that is what I think about, is in this relationship, when this person's not feeling well or says, oh, they're upset, what is my immediate reaction? Where do I go to? Do I immediately go into fix it mode, or can I sit there with the distress or tolerating the distress that, oof, I can't change it for them. I really want to, but I realize I can't, right? Or do you go into like, trying to fix it? The other part of that piece that comes to mind for me is emotional independence versus avoidance, let's say.
Yeah.
And I think that the person who sent in this question was maybe thinking in terms of this. I'm not sure, but you can be emotionally independent and want to be in a relationship and very successfully be in a relationship. Now, if you are using work as an excuse, if you are using, I'm too busy, I don't have enough time, there's other things. If you are constantly finding reasons of why you don't want a relationship or why you can't be in a relationship, I would examine those. I'd want to know, well, is this a coping mechanism that you're using, being super busy to avoid what? What are you trying to avoid? Right? Are you trying to avoid maybe rejection or the fear that you might repeat the same mistakes as before? Is there a little bit of lacking of that self-trust? Maybe feeling a little insecure that, pickers off, right?
Yeah.
I think those are the questions that I would have a person reflect on and that I would be working with them on, is okay, let's figure this out. And then kind of go into these different areas where they can answer questions about what their motivations are for doing what they're doing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I know just from context of other conversations that I've had with other people, so maybe not this particular question, but it kind of leads into this, is that I think, and this is also a personal experience for me, is that a lot of people after divorce, they get back out there, maybe, they've done the work, a lot of them haven't done the work, but let's talk about the ones that have. They've done the work, they've been healthy, they're getting back out there, and really the main tool that we all have at our disposal these days are these dating apps. And I think a lot of it is just burnout from that. Like, you could get on there and it's so frustrating, and it's just so many people are fake and they have fake photos, or they're lying about their age, or there's just so many things that, like, I know for me personally, I was very excited about the prospect of meeting somebody, for several years. And I did not meet one single man from the
Mm-hmm.
dating apps that was interested in anything beyond games. And so I'm over it. Like, I personally, I just don't even play in that arena anymore. I'm done. And I think that, there's a healthy component to it for sure. I'm definitely, I have my life together. There was a point in my life where I really wanted somebody in my life, and I don't anymore. And it's like, did I evolve into that and it's a good thing, or is it more of a coping mechanism? I don't
Yeah.
know.
I mean, I think, one of the questions that my husband and I have learned to ask of ourselves, and by the way, this didn't come naturally. This was like couples therapy and individual therapy and doing the work, right? But one of the questions that we've learned to ask of ourselves is, do I need to be here or do I want to be here? And so that's one of the things that I certainly once in a while will say, just as a check-in, not even because I am doubting the relationship or something's going on. I could be completely fine. And it's just one of those questions that has become a habit for me to check in with myself and just say, do I want to be here or do I feel that I need to be here? Right, it's always I want to be here. Anytime that I've been in a relationship where it's like, oh my gosh, I need to be here, there's usually this feeling of anxiety attached to it, a feeling of kind of fear of losing the person. And so I think that that's another question to ask yourself is, do I want to be here or do I feel that I need to be here? And so, like, for someone like yourself, Melie, you've decided, look, I'm done right now. That might change, that may not change. But I think you are in that space of being able to very clearly and successfully ask yourself, do I want to be here or do I need to be here? Why? Because you have been able to move on, do your thing, reinvent yourself in some ways, come back to who you are in essence in other ways, right?
Yeah.
And whoever you date moving forward, you can very confidently ask yourself, do I want to be here or do I need to be here? And if I'm feeling like I need to be here, oof, what else? What are the emotions? What are the feelings that are attached to that?
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. And when I think about it right now, the only place that I want to be is at home with my knitting needles. So,
yeah. Well, then,
maybe
but
that'll
that's
change,
good.
but yeah.
Yeah, but that's good. But that's healthy. I don't know, in my estimation, you're happy, right? You're healthy. And I want to say that I think one of the most important things that you are actually role modeling or expressing, whether you realize it or not, is that you have learned to be by yourself, okay with yourself, happy with yourself. And I think that's a very big marker in, kind of going back to that other gentleman's question about like, how do I know if I'm ready, for the next thing, for the next relationship? Well, okay, I think this might be one way of knowing, like, can I just be by myself with myself? Can I find things to do? What about when no friends are around and it's just me? Can I find things that give me joy, that give me pleasure, that, I don't know, that calm my nervous system, like knitting, right? So
Yeah.
yeah. And again, I think that's very empowering, but I think people struggle a lot with the thought of being alone. There's a lot of fear. And it's also one of the things that I think makes people stay in relationships a lot longer than they should be in like dysfunctional or unhealthy relationships, because of the fear of like, well, it's the evil I know best. I'm not saying it's
Yeah.
evil necessarily, but like but it's at least I know this. I don't know what's out there. So
Right. And yeah, the fear of the unknown definitely can keep people in potentially negative situations. So having that ability to assess where you're at, I think. And then like you said, I mean, it took me time. I certainly, when I was first divorced, I was not happy to be by myself. I was stressed out. I was like desperate to find somebody. And I know some people that still know me today that knew me back then that were like, oh my gosh, like you were
yeah,
crazy. So,
yeah.
it takes time. It takes doing the work, going to therapy. I had a coach, a therapist. Like I did all the work on myself that I could. So it's not something that just happens, but you have to put in the work, but it is so worth it.
You do have to put in the work. And I agree. It is, I mean, to me, it's just incredibly empowering to be able to say, look, I'm in this relationship right now, and every day is a choice that we both make to be here. It's not a need. It is, we're choosing each other, or I'm choosing myself.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I do want to go back to one thing you said. We were talking about people and dating, and you said sometimes people will ask, what if my picker's off? And I hear that a lot. Like, how does somebody know, first of all, if their picker is off? And if it is, how do they recalibrate?
Listen, so many times when we have unexamined or unresolved issues, patterns related to relationships, our concerns, our worries, our fears, our values, all these things, right? A lot of times tend to reenact unhealthy dynamics by choosing people that have traits, have some things about them that like super familiar, and we overlook those things because there's familiarity there. And so when I say, the whole thought about like, oh, people being a little bit nervous about having their picker be off, what I'm really talking about is a lack of awareness sometimes that we continue to choose the same dynamic. Different people, same dynamics, right? Sometimes reenactment of patterns and behaviors that we saw in childhood, maybe with our parents' relationships, those relationships that surrounded us the most. And then we tend to reenact those dynamics by choosing people that are going to fulfill that. It's not something that's done oftentimes consciously. It's a very subconscious thing that happens. But what I would say to that is that examining those behaviors and really, like, I don't know, make a list of the people you've dated that, where it hasn't worked out, and kind of try to see, like, do an experiment and see if there's a thread, right? Amongst all those people, like, is there one thing about all of these people that is pretty familiar and, kind of pretty consistent across the line? Like, are all these people that were somewhat emotionally unavailable? Or are all these people, when it comes down to brass tacks, are all these people who didn't really value me, or that I had to always be the one doing the planning or like being the one to get things going? What's the common thread? That's one way I would say of maybe trying to figure out if you are following a pattern. And that's, that might be part of your picker.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually did this exercise with a dating coach when I
Did
was
you?
first getting back out there. Yeah. And we went through like all my history back to like, high school. And the one common thread for myself that kept coming up was I really just picked people that I had to constantly audition for. Like I had to get them to choose me over and over again.
Yeah.
Like it was never secure. It was always this like rocky sort of, and I learned through all of that to associate that feeling with love, that flutter
Yeah.
in the stomach, that like it's actually anxiety. Like
Yeah.
that was really interesting to kind of view that and see that, wow, since I was like 14, this has
Yeah.
been my pattern.
And again, I'm so glad that you brought that up because two things, right? Like when I was 14, and that goes back to that initial question of like my first love, or one of the first questions, rather, missing how do we ever get over our first love? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about, right? It's like you're remembering that feeling. You're not conscious of it, but you are repeating a pattern because you are chasing that feeling again somehow, right? And then with respect to the whole like wanting to be chosen, if I were working with someone, I work from a lens of attachment. And so what I would ask the question, what I would work with the person about is just asking the question around, well, where did you first experience that? Like what were your earliest memories of needing to be chosen, right? Sometimes people come from a big family. It's a large family. Maybe there's a lot of siblings and there's, natural competition. Sometimes it's not that. Sometimes you just have a parent or a situation where the people who are most impactful or most present in your life are people that are busy because maybe they're, or not available rather, because they're working a lot. Maybe there's mental illness. Maybe there's alcoholism. Maybe there's emotional detachment. And so we then choose partners who are somewhat like that. And we're basically continuing to get together with our unfinished business, if that makes sense, because we're trying to find closure. We're trying to fix that. But
Yeah.
we don't have the tools or the awareness to know that that's even what we're doing. So,
Yeah.
yes.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, as we wrap up here today, I want to just say for listeners who are in the midst of divorce, I know that's a lot of you because I get your emails and your messages on social media. And I just want to say healing after a divorce, it's not a straight line. There's not a one size fits all, and sometimes those questions that we are afraid to ask are the very ones that can lead us forward. So if you are in therapy and if you are, or in counseling or with a coach, please ask these questions. Because I know when I got the question sent to me, they're like, oh, yeah, I have a therapist, but I don't want to ask her. Like, ask her, right?
Yeah.
Please let it.
Yes. Yeah. It shouldn't surprise me, but it still does that people sometimes are really afraid of being judged, even by their therapist.
Yeah.
Even if their therapist hasn't done anything to kind of give them that idea that they're judging them, it comes from what's happening internally, right? There's this
Right.
assumption that even with this person who I semi or fully feel safe with, if they really knew me, if they really knew what I was thinking, if they really knew, these things that I'm ashamed about, they would think less of me. Maybe they wouldn't want to work with me. And so there's a fear of being judged. There's fears of being misunderstood. Some people also are afraid that their concerns or their thoughts are trivial. So for example, oh my gosh, how many times haven't I heard people say, oh, I don't know if I should, I'm thinking about something, but I don't know. I don't know if I should bring this up. I don't know if it's important. And what I say to them, listen, this is a piece of the puzzle. If you were a puzzle, if you were a
Mhm.
puzzle and you didn't know, like, okay, I don't know where this piece goes. You're not going to throw it out just because you don't know where it goes. It's okay. Bring it in and we'll parking lot it, and we'll figure out later how it all connects. So there's these fears of being judged, misunderstood, or that that you're going to bore the therapist, or even shame about struggling with something that they believe like they should know better or they should have already resolved. There's also shame that people are ashamed to bring their stuff even to a therapist because there's this belief like they should have already known how to resolve it. There are a lot of things that actually prevent people from being fully transparent with their therapists. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Karen, thank you so much for being here today. I know that this episode is really going to resonate with listeners.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. These were amazing questions. Your listeners are amazing. I love these questions. They were so challenging. They really made me think a lot and in the moment, and they're great. You have an amazing audience, and thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. And listeners, I want to encourage you, please check out Karen's podcast, Emotionally Wealthy. We will have a link in the show notes below. And if this episode helped you feel a little less alone in your own rebuilding process, I would be honored if you would share it with someone else who might need to hear it. As always, thank you for being here and be well.
Oh, hey, quick reminder for you that this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not a substitute for professional advice, diagnoses, or treatment. Always consult a qualified professional with any questions you might have.
Thanks to our friends at BuzzSpear for helping with post-production and distribution.